Things began to change, though, during the 2000s. Not only did these techniques become economical, as these entrepreneurs continued to work to bring down the cost of fracking, but the price of oil and natural gas were such that it was profitable to take these risks and frack. The steady climb of oil prices during the 2000s, particularly during the late 2007 and 2008, when the price of WTI hovered around $140 per barrel, there was plenty of money to be made using these more expensive fracking methods. Natural gas production includes gross withdrawals, and production took off around that time, with production increasing by 31% from January 2008 to August 2015, the latest EIA data available. Natural gas production was really the first round of the shale boom. That didn't quite transfer to increase in oil production, though, yet, as the price of oil plummeted during the Great Recession to around $35 a barrel in early 2009. It wasn't until about the time of the Arab Spring in early 2011 when oil prices recovered and were topping $90 a barrel and then reaching above $100 a barrel in March 2011. Since then, until the latest data available in August 2015, oil production per day is up 67% to 9.3 million barrels, which remains near the record high of the late 1970s when it reached 10 million barrels of oil per day, and the latest of 9.6 million in April 2015, despite even with this substantial drop that we've seen down to $40 a barrel today. This overall shows the highly efficient oil wells that are online using hydraulic fracturing. Texas we've got to mention Texas in here somewhere, right? Texas has been the major contributor to the shale boom. Oil production per day is up 156% to 3.4 million barrels since March 2011, contributing to 56% of the increase nationwide. Despite the drop in oil prices, oil production so far has not fallen off a cliff, and neither has the Texas model, as these efficient drilling rigs remain in operation with a drop of about 200,000 barrels per day since the record high in March 2015 of 3.6 million barrels. This is a record high, historically speaking. It's important to note that this drilling activity has been a bright spot, as most of you know, in an otherwise dismal economic recovery nationwide. The U.S. labor force participation rate remains near lows not seen since the 1970s. But let's somehow cheer this 5% unemployment rate that we have, even though if you include discouraged workers and those working part-time who would like full-time employment, is closer to 10%. Something else, right? The push to end the production of fossil fuels by the Obama administration is a push to end much of the prosperity that's been created during the last decade. Consider the total employment since the Great Recession started in December 2007. Texas added 1.5 million new jobs, while the rest of the U.S. has only added 1.1 million. In other words, Texas has added 58% of all new civilian jobs during that period. Of course, these have not all been oil and gas jobs, as we have a highly diverse economy in Texas, with oil and gas jobs only being about 3% directly related to the oil and gas sector. So what can we learn from this shale boom? What does the future hold? Will sustained lower oil price, along with countless federal government regulations, end the shale boom and slow the main source of economic growth in the nation? Or will the markets continue to do what they do best and work to provide prices that send signals to producers and consumers of what will best satisfy their desires? These are the questions that our panelists here today will discuss, along with many other issues. Though I don't think they really need much of an introduction, I'll go ahead and introduce them anyway. Our first panelist is Dr. Rob Bradley, who is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Energy Research. He previously served as director of the public policy analysis at Enron, and where he also was a speechwriter for the CEO. He is a visiting fellow of the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, an adjunct scholar of the Cato Institute, and a senior research fellow, honorary, at the Center for Energy and Economics at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Bradley holds a PhD in political economy from International College, and he has written 5 fine books that I hope you all will read, and is currently working on his 6th, Political Capitalism, Insul, Enron, and Beyond. So please help me give him a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Bradley.
Well, next slide. Let's go to that one. Well, thank you very much. Vance just gave my presentation. So I'd like to introduce Vance real quickly, and then I'm going to sit down and have Steve Moore comment. Now, if I was to give the presentation that Vance outlined, I might be accused of being a master of the obvious. And you don't want to be a master of the obvious. But in the presentation so far at this event, in the Q&A, we just heard from Mr. Henry, and he's making all the basic points. So rather than look at a lot of statistics, I'm going to try to present a worldview on the theme of the increasing sustainability of the carbon-based energy economy. The key question is a carbon-based energy economy becoming more or less sustainable? And if you're data-driven, which I hope you are, I think the answer is yes, 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 and yes, and we'll get into that. But there is a Malthusian virus. Do any of you know who Robert Thomas Malthus is? Some do. He ended the happy economics of Adam Smith by saying that only misery or vice could bridge the gap between growing population and increasing, but more slowly increasing agricultural production. In other words, that mankind was doomed to live at the level of subsistence without a growing population because of the inexorable laws of population growing faster than the means of subsistence. But the Malthusian virus remains with us today. We've been through a number of alarms, mineral resources in particular, following the population bomb scare of the 60s. Paul Ehrlich, some of you will recognize that name. But I would say the population bomb, the population scare peaked in the 1960s. It then went to mineral resource shortages in the 70s. In the 80s, believe it or not, we had a quick global cooling scare, also from coal emissions, SO2. And then that turned into the global warming scare, beginning roughly with Jim Hansen's testimony in 1988. So what year are we in of the climate alarm? Is it 37? Maybe some of you can do the math. But the alarms are still here. In a book I wrote, good copies are still available, I go through the history of the energy sustainability question in 5 chapters, and it's very interesting, sort of a history of energy thought, and showing how the mainstream concluded that minerals are a fixed resource and therefore a declining resource because it is fixed. I'm going a little out of order here. There's Malthus himself. And today the scare is that we're running out of livable climate. I think that's a quotation from John Holdren, Obama's science advisor. So we're always running out of something, and now it's livable climate. Now in 1981, Julian Simon published a book called The Ultimate Resource, and this is really an amazing book because this is at the peak of oil, natural gas prices. $30 oil really meant something back in the late 70s, early 80s. That was a very rich price if you put it in inflation-adjusted terms. But Simon went against the mainstream to argue that energy was growing less scarce, not more scarce. And he was a wonderful marketer, and if you see the Look at his book cover here. Natural resources and energy are getting less scarce. Pollution in the U.S. has been decreasing. The world's food supply is improving. Population growth has long-term benefits. Very radical for 1980. Today you can look at it and say, yes. But in 1980, in other words, Simon had the right theory. So he could work through the cycles. And now we understand also that we didn't have a shortage of resources in the 70s. We had a surplus of regulation. That you can have shortages with any commodity that you want. You just put a maximum price on it that's less than the market price. You will have shortages, and guess what? You will have prices that end up being higher than if the regulation was not imposed. The fallacy of fixity. It's been with us a long, long time. You can call this, M. King Hubbard's curve. And the idea is that there's a fixed amount of supply, and if you grant that assumption from a natural science point of view, yes, you will get to a peak and a decline will occur. It's like sipping water out of a glass. There's less left. Costs must go up, prices must go up. But there's a different worldview, resourceship, and this is a term that comes from the work of a University of Texas professor that almost no one knows about named Eric Zimmerman, an institutionalist economist. And he was really the first one, at least in the economics profession, starting in the 50s, to understand the idea that resources come from the mind and not the ground. Resources are not, resources become. So if you ask natural scientists, is there more oil and gas in the United States today than when the country was formed in 1776? They'll say no. But if you ask an economist, a business person, a realist, do we have more oil and gas today than we did in 1776? The answer is absolutely yes. And resourceship is the idea of taking the neutral stuff of the earth and turning it into resources. And there's different definitions of resources. So the idea of energy expansion is that knowledge is increasing. Knowledge is not a depleting resource. It's an expanding resource. It's a cascading resource. Every innovation that we come to opens up the possibility of more and more new knowledge and technology. Just a completely new way of looking at the world. And the other thing that's very important, and capitalism has lots to do with it, a free society, is financial capital. What you need to mine, to drill. Increasing capital resources in a market society leads to greater opportunities for more supply of so-called depletable resources. So the fallacy of fixity is there is no glass. The Neo-Malthusian view of John Holdren in his younger days with Paul Ehrlich, they had an equation, I equals PAT. Negative environmental impact is population times affluence times technology. If any one of these three, or all three, two of the three increase, then the environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts must increase. This is textbook stuff from the from their textbook from the 1970s. But that has been refuted. If you look at the statistics of population, GDP, vehicle miles traveled, any economic indicator of growth, there is a negative and not positive correlation between energy usage, fossil fuel burning, and the criteria pollutants, the real pollutants, not CO2, which is not a pollutant. So this is a real-world refutation of the I equals PAT equation. The Malthusian paradigm, or neo-Malthusian paradigm, it's all down to climate change. This is the last stand of statism. And I have
Let's hope so.
a Forbes column on this that I just finished, and it's called Statism's New Clothes. We've been through all the different Malthusian scares. They've been refuted, but there's one that remains, and not coincidentally, the global warming scare came roughly in the same period that the intellectual case for socialism died. So it's sort of green turns into red, red turns into green. The good news is I think there's a happy middle in the climate debate. You've been hearing all about it. I love the term lukewarming. The alarmists don't like the term lukewarming. But certainly in a lukewarming world, I would argue that the sign of the externality is uncertain. I think there's great reasons why the global negative externality is positive and not negative from the human influence on climate. And do remember that Ehrlich and Holdren in the old days, this was in the mid to late 70s, they didn't know if it was going to be global warming or global cooling, but there's a quotation that I don't have here that said, well, the complicated Earth machinery means that this can't be good. In other words, the human influence on climate is a per se bad. I leave you with a quotation that's one of my all-time favorites from Peter Huber in Hard Green. And he makes a case that fossil fuels are the most environmentally benign of all energy resources. The quotation is, "The greenest fuels are the ones that contain the most energy per pound of material that must be mined, trucked, pumped, piped, and burnt, extracting comparable amounts of energy from the surface, renewables, would entail truly monstrous environmental disruption. The greenest possible strategy is to mine and to bury, to fly and to tunnel, to search high and low where the life mostly isn't, and so to leave the edge, the space in the middle, living in green." Bill Gates says we need an energy miracle. Mr. Gates, with all due respect, we've had the energy miracle, and it's fossil fuels. Yeah. Optimism, anyone, just to conclude. Returning to the great Julian Simon, the world's problem is not too many people, but the lack of political and economic freedom. Discoveries like resources may well be infinite. The more we discover, the more we are able to discover. And finally, humans are, on net balance, builders rather than destroyers. And with that, I'll turn it over to my better, Stephen Moore.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bradley. For our next panelist is Steve Moore, who is a distinguished visiting fellow on the Project for Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation. He is the founder and former president of the Club for Growth and is contributor to the Wall Street Journal and a daily Fox News economics commentator. He has worked for 2 presidential commissions, and in 2007, he received the Ronald Reagan Great Communicator Award from the Republican Party. Mr. Moore holds a master's in economics from George Mason University. He is the author of 6 books and is co-author with TPF's very own Kathleen White in their upcoming book, Fueling Freedom, Exposing the Mad War on Energy. That's available for pre-order on Amazon.com, so you can pre-order one of those, and it will be available in February. So without further ado, Steve Moore.
Welcome. I'm going to thank you. I think I'll just speak from here. I'm just going to basically comment on what Rob said. By the way, Rob, I really believe that Rob Bradley is one of the foremost authorities on energy policy in the country. So it's an honor to be on the stage with you. I'm so glad you mentioned my mentor, Julian Simon. I worked with Julian for 15 years. I met him in 1980, right when that book was coming out, the Infinite Resource. And you know, one of the things Julian said, he was just so full of wisdom. And by the way, I wish, he died about 20 years ago. I wish that he could have lived to have seen the shale oil and gas boom and fracking and horizontal drilling, because this is exactly what he talked about. He saw this, that this was going to come before anyone did. And it's all human ingenuity. And you're right, all of these resources come from the human mind, not from the ground. But Julian had one profound thing he used to say about population. He said, you know, that there are two species that eat chickens. Humans eat chickens, and chicken hawks eat chickens. And he said, but the more chicken hawks there are, the fewer chickens there are, the more humans there are, the more chickens there are. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, fundamental wisdom in that. So, when you think, right? So, I'm just going to make a couple of comments and show you a couple of slides and touch on a few of the things that I mentioned last night. And let me start with this, which is, this actually comes from Mark Mills' book. I love this chart. We used it, we reproduced it in the book that we're coming out with in February. And the red line is the total employment in the United States from 2007 through the end of 2013. If I fast forwarded this through 2014, that red line finally comes above zero. So that means it took us 6 or 7 years to recover every lost job during the Great Recession. It was a horrific recession with 6 or 7 million lost jobs, and as you all know, it was an incredibly slow and pathetic recovery. And if you look at the blue line, that is the oil and gas increase in employment. And so what that's telling you is that for 6 years, every net new job that was created in the United States was a result of the energy boom. This is why I said last night that if it hadn't been for the energy boom, Barack Obama would not have been reelected. There's no way. What this is telling you is we still would have been in a recession had it not been for this incredible technological boom. And I always say that life and politics are so rich with irony, and the ultimate irony of the Barack Obama's presidency is that the industry that he hates the most is the one that actually has flourished the most, notwithstanding everything he's done to try to stop it from happening. So, you know, this is basically an amazing story of productivity. And then this is something that I kind of cringe to show you all in this room, because many of you are in the energy industry. You don't like this too much. If you're a producer of energy, these are the kind of bitter fruits of the amazing increase in production that you all have brought about. But for the rest of us, this is a huge windfall. So if you look at what's happened to the price, the oil price, and most of you have seen this many, many times. So remember a year ago last summer, we saw prices, I don't know what they hit their top at, Rob, maybe 110, something like that, $110, $105 a barrel. Now, you know, they're at about $45 a barrel. So that's about a 60% decline, because, in large part, because of the increase in supply that we've been able to produce in the United States. Now, the implication of that for the rest of the economy is enormously positive. I think a lot of people have this story wrong, that, you know, a falling energy price is bad. Yeah, it's bad if you're a producer of oil and gas, but for the rest of us, it's a huge windfall. So I call this about a $150 billion annual tax cut to the American consumer. I mentioned last night that every penny reduction in the price of gasoline at the pump puts $1 billion more into the hands of consumers. But it's not just consumers. Actually, the big beneficiaries of this are producers, like, for example, our manufacturing industry. So one of the stories that hasn't been told enough is that the United States is now experiencing a mini renaissance that I think could turn into a major renaissance in manufacturing. We're making things in America again. And one of the reasons we're making things in America is, this is one of the parts of the story, Rob, that needs to get told more often. What happened 10 years ago is that Europe went all in on the green energy stuff. You know, they went in with the solar energy, the windmills and so on. They had all the, you know, the restrictions on carbon emissions and so on. And it has killed their economy, and it's killing their manufacturing sector. Germany is a good case in point, where we are now, for the first time in 50 years, we are now seeing German manufacturing companies leave Germany, and guess where they're coming? Here. They're coming here, and the reason they're coming is because the energy prices are about 2/3 more expensive in Germany than they are here. So, as you've said many times, energy is the master resource. If you can lower your costs by moving here, you're going to do it, and that's happening big time. And so that's a great story of American economic renewal. The other thing I'll just show you is, this is something I love to show students, because, now focus on the second panel, The green line is the increase in production of green energy, wind and solar power. By the way, over the last 8 years since, by the way, George W. Bush was terrible on this stuff too. So under Bush and Obama, we've spent, I think the 2006 energy bill we passed was one of the worst pieces of legislation we've ever passed. It was filled with green energy subsidies for wind power, solar power, all this stuff. So we've spent about $150 to $200 billion over the last 8 years subsidizing wind and solar with taxpayer money. The oil and gas industry, you know, we could argue about whether they're subsidized or not, but even taking the worst case scenario, the subsidies to oil and gas are minuscule per, you know, amount of energy produced. And so what's interesting about this is then look at the results. This is such a classic case study, by the way, setting energy aside, about why central planning never works. Because 10 years ago, nobody foresaw the oil and gas, shale oil and gas revolution happening and fracking. So nobody thought that this was going to happen. And the brainiacs in Washington said, we've got to move into, you know, solar and wind. As recently as 3 or 4 years ago, President Obama was running around the country saying we have to invest in wind and solar power. Why? Because we're running out of fossil fuels. I mean, he said that as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. Here we are, the biggest boom in the history of civilization, and right on the eve of that, he's talking about how we're running out of this stuff. So the amazing statistic that you all know, that I always ask college kids, and they have no idea about this, I say, what percentage of our energy today in America comes from wind and solar power? You all know the answer. You may think, you know, well, the answer is about 3%. About 3%. And so the way I like to frame this to students is, let's say we do move forward with a huge new subsidies to solar and wind to try to, promote this industry. And let's say over the next 10 years, I don't think this is possible, but let's stretch our imaginations and say in the next 10 years we could quadruple the amount of energy we get from wind and solar. Again, I don't think that's feasible, but let's say that we could do it. Where are we going to get the other 85% of our energy from, right? So in other words, even if their wildest fantasy comes true, we're still going to need 85% of our energy from nuclear power, from wind, from oil, gas, and coal. And that's why we need to promote this continued revolution. And one last chart, and then I'll throw it open to questions. Some of you who saw me speak here last year have seen this. I've updated this, but this is the crux of the story, that we can use the energy revolution as a massive driver of our economy. And we can become the greatest exporter of oil and gas in the history of this, and coal, by the way. I'm a big fan of coal as well. Now, if you look at the blue line, what this is telling you is that is the Obama recovery. It's been a recovery. It hasn't been, you know, we did get out of the recession, but it's been pretty flimsy. So we've grown, the economy has grown by about 16% during this recovery, which is roughly a 2% compounded annual rate of growth. That's with $800 billion fiscal stimulus plan, Obamacare, tax increases on the rich, 3 minimum wage increases, the Fed printing $4 trillion. The left basically used every single page of their playbook. Everything they could possibly conceive of, they threw at this recession, and it gave us 2% growth. Reagan, you know, I worked for the Gipper. You know, he came into office, we cut tax rates, we deregulated, we got inflation under control under Volcker by pulling back the supply of money. In one sentence, Reagan's philosophy was government is not the solution, government is the problem. And now you see the results of this, and this is something liberals don't have much of a response for. The free enterprise, you know, recovery created 4% growth. The Obama recovery created 2% growth. What that means is that if we had had a Reagan-style expansion over the last 8 years, or I'm sorry, 6.5, 7 years, we would now have an economy that would almost be $3 trillion larger. That's gigantic. That's, you know, if you prorated that to every family, that means every family in America would have $20,000 to $25,000 of income. And in fact, the average family today has about $1,500 less income. That's the reason, ladies and gentlemen, people are so cranky, is they're not seeing an increase in their take-home pay. And what I'm saying in our book with Kathleen is, if we get this energy story right, I mean, imagine how big this story could be if we elected a president who wanted this stuff to happen. We're talking about maybe adding a percentage point or two to our GDP each year, which would be a spectacular period of prosperity. And it's, by the way, one of the reasons I'm very optimistic about the future of the American economy. I do think we're going to elect a president who wants this stuff to happen. I do think we're going to see this revolution happen, and it is going to be incredibly liberating, not just for us in the United States, but for all the people in the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And with that, we'll open it up to some questions. Who would like to ask a question? Right here, front, right behind.
Yeah, I'm just a little concerned after hearing this panel that we've really confused the audience about our panel that suggested that there was a finite amount of oil. What we were really saying is that as we deplete these resources, we think the cost of our fossil fuel energy will go up and that there will be competing energies. When I want a national energy plan, I want something that recognizes that wind and solar is not it. Mm-hmm. That we would identify what are the characteristics of any new energy source that we would be looking for, mm-hmm. and that any research be focused in that direction. But get rid of this silly idea of wind and solar. From an engineering standpoint, it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about a national energy plan, I want us to set that goal with that new president that says we're going to use our natural resources as a geopolitical and economic benefit to the country.
So, you know, it's interesting. I would make the case to you, I wonder how many of you would agree with me, or whether you'd agree with me, Rob. And as I've said last night, I'm not picking a horse in this race. I just want whatever works, right? But I would make the case to you that the solar and wind industry would be better off today if the government had never gotten involved in it. You know, the government has led them on a horse chase in the wrong direction. And I just think we'd be technologically more advanced if the government, I mean, we've spent money on Solyndra and all of these programs that have been complete failures that never produced a single kilowatt of energy. So I am not here, look, I think nuclear energy, as I said last night, I think has amazing potential if we can, with these new micro nuclear plants that are smaller, more efficient, that, you know, are much less susceptible to you know, nuclear accidents and so on. That could be a part of our energy future as well. And incidentally, one other thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, is which is that one of the things that the Google people found, you heard this story last night about how they abandoned the renewable energy. What the scientists there said is, look, if we must, let's say that global climate change is the greatest, you know, danger to this in the history of civilization that's upon us, and we have to move away from a carbon future. Let's just accept that premise for a minute. If that is so, there's only one thing we can do without completely destroying our economy. We'd have to build 100 nuclear power plants. I mean, we just have to, right? And yet the left doesn't want to do that either. In other words, think about this. They're against hydropower, they're against oil, they're against coal, they're against gas, they're against nuclear. They're against anything that works, right? If it doesn't work, they're for it, and if it does work, they're against it.
Yeah, my view, and I've heard this a little bit from Martin Mills last night, and certainly in the question, there's a mentality, sort of an engineering mentality, that we need to have an energy plan. And what's implicit in that is that there's a major market failure with carbon-based energy, and I reject that. I do recognize that you know, this century is going to be the century of carbon-based energy. I think the market share of oil, gas, and coal is going to grow in this century and not shrink. And we're already at 80% or more of the world's consumption being oil, gas, or coal. Now, on the electricity side, nuclear is certainly a backstop technology, but it's still a backstop technology. Oil, LNG-fired, coal-fired electric generation has a major market advantage. So
why is that? Why is that?
Price. And something like nuclear, you're spending all your capital cost up front, and the market doesn't like that. It's just too risky. You'd rather have something that would lower capital cost up front, more variable costs. That's what's financeable. That's what's has a lower risk profile. So number one, I think that there isn't a major market failure with oil, gas, and coal, and that the market share will increase. In the very, very distant future, and we heard an estimate of we have 200 years left of fossil fuels, in some future century, we could well go to other primary energies, but those primary energies are going to be totally different from what we're thinking about today with wind and solar. I am very bullish on the increasing sustainability of carbon-based energy, and we certainly don't, number one, we don't need government planning in this. And I would also say with civil society, with the Gates Foundation and all, they have got to get off this climate and energy kick and get the money to real human needs. There's an opportunity cost here of climate alarmism, and we've got to emphasize that not only with changes in government policy, but also with civil society.
All right, we have another question right up here.
With the dollar being a floating dollar, rather, in your chart on oil price, wouldn't you need to adjust for that float, because we've gone from a very weak dollar to a strong dollar? So,
yeah. I mean, that's right. And the thing that's interesting about the oil market versus, for example, the natural gas market is that there is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know a lot more about this than I do, but there's basically one world price for oil. I mean, it differs a little bit from one place to the other, but oil is a, easily transportable commodity, and therefore, Asia pays pretty much the same as what we pay versus what, they pay in Europe. The big advantage we have right now when it comes to the relative prices of energy is natural gas, because we're now paying, I think Kathleen said last night, what's natural gas at now, $2 or $3 or something like that? It was at 14, and then it came to, I think, let's say it's somewhere in the $2 to $4 range. What's amazing, you want to see a competitive advantage we have. So in Europe, they're still paying $10 for natural gas, and in Asia, they're paying about 12. That's one of the reasons we have such a huge competitive advantage. Why in the world are we not using these resources? One last thing. I mean, the president said on Saturday, in the wake of these horrific attacks in Paris, that we are doing everything as a nation to combat the terrorist threat from the Islamic State. It's just false. We're not. We're not. Because if we were, we would be producing our own energy, right? We would be going balls to the walls on drilling for our energy, because every barrel of oil that this is so self-evident, it's an obvious point. Every barrel of oil we drill here is one less barrel of oil we have to get from people who are trying to kill us. So why wouldn't we do that?
One comment on prices. Recently calculated the real price of oil from 1950 to today, adjusted for inflation, and that price is within $1 of current oil prices. So historically speaking, oil prices today are very average if you look at the last 60, 65 years. But if you look at natural gas prices here in the U.S., substantially below the historical average.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Right over here, you had your hand up.
Thanks. A broader question with a kidding opening. Knowing that Washington's the wealthiest city in the world and produces nothing but red tape, is there any
we're good at it.
Oh yeah, you are correct. My question is, we can talk about this, but is there any recognition in Washington? I mean, when you look at how hopelessly incompetent the Republican Congress has been, is there any recognition that the bureaucracy has to be cut back? I mean, everyone talks about it, and other than Reagan, no one has ever reduced the bureaucracy, the regulations, the red tape. Is there really any hope? As much as I agree with every word you say, is there any hope those idiots in Washington will do anything?
Well, not if she gets elected, right? So, yeah, look, I mean, it's tough to roll back regulation. 'Cause once, you know, Ronald Reagan said the closest thing to immortality on this earth is a government program or regulation. So it's very difficult, but we can slow it down. You know, we can slow it down. And I think, you know, when it comes to this election, and we talked about this last night, you know, that this is not the most important election of our lifetime. The 1980 election was the most important of our lifetime, but this is a really important election. You're going to see a complete conflict of visions. I mean, Americans are going to be choosing between two completely philosophically opposite. I mean, my God, Bernie Sanders the other night said we should go back to 90% tax rates. I mean, that's lunatic. That's craziness. You know, Hillary wants to create a 45% capital gains tax. Neither of them want to do any of this energy stuff. I've been working with the Republican presidential candidates. I think all of them are basically saying, hell yes, we should be doing this. I mean, we can create jobs, we can create huge increases in our output, we can improve our national security. This is going to be a central focal point of debate over the next 14 months. And good, let's have a national debate. And one last thing, the liberals love to talk about how much they care about the middle class and low-income people. These are middle-class jobs. I mean, my God, we're talking about people in the energy industry that are making $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year. And these are blue-collar, unionized, oftentimes unionized workers. We've got, in fact, one last thing. We've got to start going, you know, you talked about the green menace, and it's true. You know, the old saying is that greens are the new reds, and it is that is absolutely true. We as a movement have to start going to union halls, the electricians, the pipe fitters, the construction workers. We've got to go to the Teamsters and say, we're the ones who are trying to save your jobs and expand your jobs, and they're the ones that are trying to destroy your jobs, right? Don't you think we should be doing that? I mean, we should be going to these people and saying, we're pro-worker, they're the ones who are not. So, yeah, we can win. We can win on this.
All right. Thank you all so much. Please help me give them a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Lots to look forward to in the future. Overall, markets work, government doesn't. All right, have a good day.